Regarding video game history, few consoles can quite match the charm of the Sega Saturn. First released in Japan in 1994, this beast was a 2D powerhouse, with an awesome selection of polygonal exclusives to its name too. Titles like Nights into Dreams, Daytona USA and Guardian Heroes are now the stuff of legends with retro gaming enthusiasts. But unfortunately, as amazing as this magical machine was in the United States, this platform was never positioned effectively to compete with the runaway success of the Sony PlayStation. When it comes to the Saturn's final days, gamers often reflect on the greatness of Panzer Dragoon Saga or the quirky brilliance of Magic Knight Rayearth, the last Sega Saturn game to see release in North America. As great as these late releases were though, these were not amongst the true final games for the hardware. North America may have got its last Saturn game on the 11th of December 1998, but the console would soldier on to March of 2000 in Japan. So, bearing that in mind, I am Lady Decade, and this is the final curtain call of the Sega Saturn, the story of the console after all releases stopped in North America. When it comes to the decline of the Saturn, history shows us that the device would be on the losing end of an aggressive pricing war against the PlayStation. The PlayStation's dominance in the US would mean that the Saturn was being outsold 2-1 by 1996, and by the end of that very same year, the Saturn in the United States was being nearly outsold 3-1 against Sony's Little Monster. Even bundling the Saturn with Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter 2 and Virtua Cop at Christmas was not enough to turn the tide, and by the time the Nintendo 64 hit shelves, the Saturn would struggle even more. Things began to turn sour for the Saturn in Japan too, thanks to the outrageous success of Final Fantasy VII, leading to Sony controlling 47% of the global gaming market, Nintendo controlling 40%, leaving Sega with a measly 12%. Sega's financial situation was getting pretty grim, and at the beginning of 1998, Bernie Stolar became the president of Sega of America. Retrospectively, the former president would reflect back on this period, stating, "I thought the Saturn was a mistake as far as hardware was concerned. The games were obviously terrific, but the hardware just wasn't there." After 5 years of declining profits, in March 1998, Sega announced financial losses. To course correct the company, they would announce the discontinuation of the Saturn in North America to prepare for the arrival of the next Sega console. This meant that throughout 1998, only 7 games saw release on the platform in the region, with, as stated earlier, these being rounded off with Magic Knight Rayearth. In contrast though, with the system managing to find a much bigger audience, support would continue for the Saturn in Japan, even after the mighty Dreamcast was released. With an install base that the Nintendo 64 never managed to beat, you can see why Sega would choose to support the Saturn for longer on home territory. In fact, nearly 800 Saturn games were released in such a region. However, we will only cover those that saw release after the console died in the West for conciseness and doing something different. Let's start with the small selection of games available by Christmas of 1998. The Saturn would receive 4 new titles launched in the second half of December, so let's discuss them. But before we get into that, I have got loads of videos like this covering great hardware coming up on this channel, so subscribe now, bitches.
Ooh, you're hard showing off.
Regarding late Saturn games, I don't think you can get duller and more predictable than the first post-North American demise game. A Mahjong title named Yoshimoto Mahjong Club was also available on the PlayStation. The saving grace though was that it did offer strange live-action full-motion videos, but this is certainly not a game I could have seen anyone rushing out to import. A week later, we would see the release of Farland Saga Toki no Michishirube. This one seems to be a role-playing strategy game that looks similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, with different terrain heights seemingly impacting turn-based combat. This one doesn't look bad, but sadly I do not speak Japanese, so I cannot explore the title further. From what I've read though, the Farland Saga series seems to be popular in Japan, Korea and China, and these games are predominantly being played by gamers using Windows on PC 98. However, 4 games were released on the Saturn, with this being the 4th and final final entry. 2 days before Christmas 1998 saw the launch of 6-inch My Darling. This one is a creepy looking visual romance novel, but is said not to include any adult content. YoVideogames outlines that in this one you follow a high school student named To Be the Player who lives at home with their family. One day after school they stumble upon a box buried in the woods and find a strangely shaped figure. Bringing it home the next day, the student hears a voice in their room and soon discovers it is coming from a tiny girl named Eto Sarah. Standing in at literally only 6 inches, she is soon joined by other miniature girls appearing from this magic box, with them quickly becoming the students' secret roommates. For some reason, playing as this socially awkward student, you spend the game trying to romance these tiny beings. Because that's not creepy at all. The final Japanese Saturn release in 1998 would be released on the same day as 6-inch My Darling, bringing us to girl doll toy Tamashii wo Kudasai. Is this going to be another weird insult game? Well, yes it is. Information about this game online is extremely scarce, but from what we can see from footage of this so-called adventure game, it features its fair share of lewd imagery. This one apparently features a story where you play as a scientist developing human-like androids. In Girl Doll Toy, you pick up a grateful android that was fated for disposal before you saved them, whereby you upgrade them and even name them Erica. The scientist you play as soon begins to feel romantic emotions towards the glorified sex doll, resulting in the sort of experience that would fit perfectly amongst the PCFX library. If you know, you know. Moving into 1999, the Saturn would receive some support throughout the first 8 months of the year, with January seeing 2 more games added to the Saturn's library. The first was Touryuu Densetsu Elan Doree. Now this is a cool release. Being ported over from the Sega Titan video from the previous year, this title is a quirky 3D fighting game where you get to face off against opponents while each of you ride dragons. Dragons all have their own elemental abilities and your fight can be made to jump off a dragon for an additional way of fighting. This isn't the best fighting game ever made, but it certainly is unique, and if you haven't seen it before, it is one of the more memorable late Saturn releases. Roommate W Futari came out on the same day as the simulation game and part of Daytime Polystar's Roommate series. Information on these games seems to be rather scarce online, and since they're in Japanese, I only have the in-game imagery to go off. From what I can see, this title features many pretty anime girls who are likely your roommates, and you get to wander around your apartment and play card games with them. Only Japan seem to get these strange games. February 1999 introduced Device Reign, yet another strategy RPG for the platform. The game features lots of anime-style graphics and gameplay-wise it seems right up my street, offering up grid-based combat in interesting-looking environments that give this one a cool visual flair. In modern-day Tokyo with additional first-person perspective adventure elements, Device Reign could be fun if it was in English. March would be the busiest month in 1999 for the Sega Saturn, with 5 more releases coming to the platform. This included Yukyugen Tsukyoko Ensemble 2 from Starlight Mary, the company that's brought Device Reign to the platform. This is another adventure game with romance elements, as I guess Japanese Sega Saturn owners must have desperately needed love.
Oh, love me? Pathetic.
Senken Kigyuden, which translates as The Legend of Sword and Fairy, also came out in March, and is slightly less cringe. This RPG comes from Taiwan and parallels Grandia, albeit featuring a much simpler graphical style. Again, if this was available in full English, it looks potentially very interesting. I guess since this was available in Taiwan too, we can't refer to it as a Japanese exclusive. However, it still arrived on the platform after the system died in the West. Now, Dungeons and Dragons Collection from Capcom is a fantastic Sega Saturn offering. Amazingly, this one combines 2 classic arcade beat-em-ups, Shadow over Mystara and Tower of Doom. The best way to describe this magnificent greatness would be as the Sega Saturn's answer to Golden Axe. And before anyone gets cocky, no, Golden Axe the duel doesn't count. While Dungeons and Dragons Tower of Doom saw release on the Saturn worldwide, only Japan got this double pack. It is also of note to mention that the game differs from the other beat-em-ups in some ways, as careful tactics must be utilised as different strategies are required to effectively take out different enemies. Kiss Yori also came out in March, which, you guessed it, is another dating simulator. Japanese Sega Saturn owners must have been so damn lonely to have this many incel games. I'm so sorry I keep mentioning these. I said we would get through mentioning all of the late releases, so I kind of have to. This brings us to the last game of March 1999, Derby Stallion. This one sounds sexual in nature because it is. Sega Saturn owners were just as interested in playing games about horses having sex as in people having sex. This one is literally a race horse breeding simulator. Because, well, Japan. The Japanese loved these games across different hardware. Over 6 million copies were sold. Jokes aside, I guess it is no different to those football manager games that people like playing, only this one is about horse sex. Moving along to April, we first got Tokimeki Memorial Drama Series Volume 4, Tabadachi no Uta. This mouthful from Konami is a visual novel spin-off game to the original Tokimeki Memorial. Once again, this game is based on trying to romance literal schoolgirls and is said to feature a story where the player runs a marathon just before graduation with the game, then branching off into different directions depending on which girl you choose to pursue. Perverted Saturn owners in April could also pick up a Ryoko Inoue Chatting Room, an adult game from Daytime Polystar. From the limited info I can find out about this one, you move in with a 17-year-old girl as a roommate and soon learn she misses her family and is emotionally vulnerable. So, I guess you all know what that means. That's right, your player does everything possible to make her get into bed with them. To do this, you must carefully listen to what she is saying so that you can appropriately manipulate her and win. Moving on, we have Friends Seisha no Kagayaki, another adult visual novel. Were these honestly the most lucrative games to release on the Saturn near the end of its life cycle? There's just so many of them! YoVideogames outlines that in this one, you make your way to a nice resort to reunite with some of your classmates from high school. In particular, your tennis team members. The game focuses on romance and features a full map of the place you're staying at, the rural town and its surrounding area. This visual novel features a typical static anime character sprites with light animation, such as talking animations pasted over background images. CG event scenes occur with the right character at the right place and time. Your dialogue choices and actions affect how the story progresses, and if you will end up with one of the heroines or help with the matchmaking for your friends. This period should be known as Sega Saturn, the Virgin Years. There would be no more Sega Saturn releases past this point until July 1999, with Japan next getting the rather underwhelming Pro Shinen Mahjong Tsu wa Mono. Yes, this was just another Mahjong game, but at least it provides a break from the crazy amount of games with dating elements included. Later that same month, YoVideogames Mitsumete Itai hit shelves. Again, this one is super Japanese, so let me read YoVideogames' description for you. YoVideogames Mitsumete Itai is an adventure game with static graphics, in which the game advances as the player chooses what to do from a list of possible actions. Long time ago, a man and a woman made a promise, stating that although they were destined to be lonely souls, they should always remain together. But by a cruel joke of fate, they were separated and sealed into two jewels that were hidden for generations. Manami, who left the country 6 years before, has found one of the jewels while travelling. He will return to Japan to meet with their friends from childhood. This will entail a meeting of the two jewels again, for the second jewel seems to be owned by his father. So this game has got romance elements, but it's not as creepy as the other entries on this list. August of 1999 would finally bring something spectacular for the Saturn for a change. Alongside Dungeons & Dragons Collection, another Capcom offering, this would be one of the Saturn games of the year. Street Fighter 03, known as Alpha 3 in the West for the Saturn, would be an excellent arcade conversion. The Saturn version uses the extra RAM to include more frames and sprites, making it near arcade perfect. In Street Fighter Alpha 3, players can choose from a diverse roster of characters, each with of unique fighting styles and special moves. The game features old and new characters, including classic fighters like Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, and Sagat, and newcomers like Karen, Armika, and Cody. Street Fighter Alpha 3's gameplay follows traditional 2D fighting game mechanics. Players engage in one-on-one battles against opponents, using a combination of punches, kicks, and special moves to defeat their opponents and deplete their health bar. Street Fighter Alpha 3 also features multiple gameplay modes, including arcade, versus mode, training mode, and various unlockable gameplay options. The game received positive reviews from critics and fans, praising its graphics, gameplay mechanics, and extensive character roster. Overall, Street Fighter 3 is considered one of the standout entries in the series, offering a compelling fighting experience with its diverse cast of characters and deep gameplay mechanics. So, a wonderful addition to the Saturn library. Past this point, things would start to go quiet. October would see Sonic 3D Blast released on the Saturn, but this had already been released in the West on the hardware years earlier, so I guess Sega was just trying to squeeze more juice out of the aging system. Gamers would also have to wait 5 more months before receiving anything else, with the Sega Saturn's final release being made available on the 30th of March 2000. This last game would be an entry in Capcom's, by this point, legendary Final Fight series, but rather than playing as a beat-em-up like its predecessors, Final Fight Revenge would instead function as a polygonal fighting game. This title, which had been previously released in arcades the prior year, has a poor reputation for featuring subpar graphics compared to its fighting game contemporaries, and most notoriously, playing nothing like a Final Fight game. If you play it though, there is nothing particularly egregious about it, and I guess it is far more interesting than the glut of dating games that was suffocating the system throughout this last period. Pair this outing with the excellent Street Fighter 03 and Dungeons & Dragons collection. Capcom were unquestionably the Sega Saturn's MVP during the dying days of this beloved hardware. So what have we learned from all of this? The final days of the Saturn are a tale of sex, thugs, and mahjong, with many of these late releases designated specifically to appeal to gaming tastes. Want video games about horse sex? Then the Saturn in 1999 had you covered. If you enjoyed this video about the Saturn's final curtain call, subscribe now and watch my upload about when the Saturn destroyed the Sony PlayStation. Peace.